mich des Lebens wilde Kreis umstrickt. Hast du meine Herz zu warme Lippen zunden, hast mich in eine bessere Welt entrückt, in eine bessere Welt entrückt.
Do you like it done like that? I don't know that Schubert would have done. Let's spool back to 1817 and hear it the way he did.
Du holde Kunst, in wie viel grauen Stunden, wo mich des Lebens wilde Kreis umstrickt.
Well, you might be thinking, thank God for progress. Or you might be thinking it's like tea without sugar. Once you've got used to it, you can't imagine how you used to tolerate it any other way.
Oft hat ein Seufzer deiner Harfe entflossen, ein süßer, heiliger Akkord von dir.
But is this really how it sounded in 1817? How do we know? Surely Schubert would have loved to write for an iron-frame, 2-ton concert grand, if only somebody had thought of it in time. Anyway, he's only one stage in a process. Haven't successive generations of performers got their own ideas to offer? And you might like sugar in your tea. How's your saccharine intolerance? There's more to this than just zapping a Schubert song with your remote control. The questions I've just raised threaten the whole convention of our Western musical tradition. As a performer gets to know a piece well, he finds new possibilities in it. But can the resulting transformations eventually reach the point of distortion? Authenticity, a useful if imprecise word, recreates historical conditions. It's like cleaning the varnish off an old master. What sort of difference does it make? We're living through a revolution in the performance of more and more of the musical repertoire. Almost instinctive certainties are being questioned historically, and in the hands of the great performers of the authentic brigade, new instincts are being developed, or better, old instincts rediscovered. Historically informed performance on the right sort of instrument is here to stay. So, are other ways of doing it wrong?
There is a sort of sniff, a whiff, a sulphurous tone of fanaticism that anything that's not done like that is prima facie wrong. We will erase the last 200 years because they were wrong. Now, I don't understand. Why is that? Why is Bruno Walter wrong? It isn't wrong. No, they are right, we are right, we're all wrong.
What is authenticity? We don't know what it is. And I think to go back all the time, to a kind of historical perspective is also denying to the composer the right to progress.
We are not trying to be authentic. We are not trying to produce the one performance. There is no one way. There's a lot of bad ways of playing music, but there's no one good way. It's a complete red herring. We're trying to be informed about how to play. We're trying to take the composer seriously.
One of the ways of killing a tradition is to do what the authentic music movement has done, which is to separate the past entirely from the present, put it in a kind of glass box in a museum, and make it inaccessible. Inaccessible because it's played on different instruments with in a different state of mind, with different expectations, and even to a different audience. All this, I think, is stultifying and removes us precisely from the great masterpieces of the past instead of bringing them nearer to us.
People were getting hot under the collar about this, even when the argument applied only to Bach and before. And now it's Beethoven and beyond. We're right into the core of the orchestral repertoire, and orchestras and concert halls are entrenched, expensive establishments, in both senses of that word. It's high time to take a fresh look at the whole business, to air the arguments, to think of the questions.
Apparently, people flock in and out of the world's biggest record store, demanding squeaky clean CDs of authentic this and authentic that. The classical charts have been stood on their heads. Former star conductors have sunk lower and lower in the face of the new opposition.
Do you come here often, Nick?
Well, actually, as it happens, I come here not actually to buy records, but to check on interesting things that have come out, and then I go away and ask for review copies of them.
That's a method. Is it new, this business of authentic performance?
Well, I think you've got to go back a long way, really, to the 18th century to find the first time when people were interested in the music of the past. The last decades of the 18th century were a very self-conscious time. Burney and Hawkins were writing their histories of music. But when they performed the music of the past, they brought it up to date. And it was really only in the 19th century that people began to have a very archaeological approach to the music of the past.
They were just interested in the right notes on the paper.
Yes, in getting an absolute scholarly rectitude about the thing. But that didn't go over into performance. When Mendelssohn made his famous revival of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, he adapted the score considerably, he cut it, and that seemed the natural thing to do. The whole performance tradition changed and evolved.
So when did people start taking the correct notes and playing them in the early fashion?
Well, I think you have to look at pioneers like Arnold Dolmetsch at the beginning of the 20th century, who was both a scholar and an instrument maker, but of course not a born performer, whereas at the same time there were people like Wanda Landowska, who played Bach's music on the harpsichord, and she was a born performer, and her music making still carries enormous conviction today. It's very thrilling and very exciting.
This was when? About 1920?
That's right, and of course that started a whole development, the two poles of the Dolmetsch approach and the Landowska approach. Some people have placed more reliance on historical information, and some people have placed more reliance on their instinctive feeling about how the music ought to go. And it's in that interesting tension between the two that the whole debate has evolved.
David Owen, Norris. Authentic performance.
Well, if you say it confidently enough, it opens all sorts of doors. But what exactly does it involve? Let us seek enlightenment, and where else but at the BBC? As a first step, I've asked some experts to join me at Television Centre so I can pick their brains. 54 experts, to be precise, the London Classical Players and their conductor, Roger Norrington. When Haydn finished his last symphony in 1795, these were the instruments he had in mind. None of these gut strings is wound with metal, as they usually are today, and they're quite loosely stretched too. The wind instruments have few keys and a narrower bore than nowadays, and the brass and drums could have walked straight off one of Napoleon's battlefields.
But as well as the instruments being different, you must have to play them in a different way too.
Yes, to some extent they show you how to do that, the instruments, because they sound different. For instance, if you have gut strings on a violin, you can't dig into it as you do with the modern steel strings. The woodwind articulate more and have different, because of the different keys, there are notes that they can't reach so easily. The brass play differently. The horns, of course, particularly differently because of this business of the hand horning to make certain notes in tune which otherwise wouldn't be because there are no valves at all. And the other thing that shows us what to do is, of course, the instrumental tutors of the day. People wrote, particularly at this time of Haydn, people wrote books about how to play the piano, how to play the violin. You're expected to do it with your teacher as well, of course. But they tell us a lot about what you didn't do and what you do. For instance, in string playing, vibrato is referred to only as one kind of decoration, to be used rather sparingly. Sometimes they show you, a tutor will show you, the notes to use it on. Sforzando notes, little strong notes. They'll put a little wiggly line on a piece of music to show you where there is vibrato, and there might be 5 bits of vibrato on one page, you know. Not continuous, which is beautiful in its way, but it wasn't used then. So in one's search to try and be practically producing the sound of the time, then that's what one goes for.
The most noticeable thing about the music we're listening to just now is the speed. Let's listen to a bit again.
Yeah.
Doesn't really sound like a slow movement.
No, I don't think it is really a slow movement. That's a strange thing about all these classical symphonies. As far as I'm concerned, they didn't really have slow movements. They had slower movements. And at the time, when they were written, people used to talk about them not as slow, but as allegrettos and andantes. But what happened was that the word andante, from meaning keep moving, buddy, you know, as a New York policeman would say, gradually during the 19th century it came to mean quite slow. So when Mahler uses andante, he means go slowly. So it's rather tricky, that. Then with this particular piece, you've got it's in 2/4, and the 4 is the crotchet, of course, and so the tempo, the andante, refers to the crotchet. 1, 2, 1, kind of like walking down the road with Samuel Johnson. And what happened again in the 19th century was that people began to use the quaver, half that value, as a unit of measure. So they would think, a modern conductor might well think, well, the andante must refer to the quaver. So that halves the speed. It means it goes twice as slow. And then if andante meant something slow as well, that twice as slow would become 3 or 4 times as slow. And that's really what's happened. This speed would be instantly recognizable by a late 18th century audience as a sort of gavotte. We would say a quick step. At least people who are as old as I am would think of it as a quick step, not as a slow foxtrot, you know. So that's another way we can check it. Is it danceable? Does it move easily? Because all the music of the time moved easily. And is it singable? There's another way we can check it. All the tutors of the period said, when you play an instrument, it should sound as if you're singing. So that's another way we can check it. Then, of course, just about a few years later than this piece was written, very end of the 18th century, people started to develop the metronome. And early on in the 19th century, people started to give metronome marks to their arrangements of Haydn symphonies and Mozart symphonies. Beethoven, of course, himself used the metronome. Well, Hummel, who was a pupil of Mozart, for instance, arranged this very symphony, this very movement for a string quartet, and published in 1820. And he gave a metronome mark to it. So what did he think was the right speed? He thought 58 was the right speed. And here's 58 on my rather modern metronome. That's pretty nearly the speed that I have chosen.
Does it mean that the slower performances that we've got used to are invalid?
No, nothing is invalid in music performance. You can do what you like. It just makes it rather difficult. We tried it out, didn't we? See, it's very beautiful like that. It sounds lovely. But to me, it misses the sort of wry humour and wit that there is also there. I can't perform it much slower than this because I find the texture breaks down, and particularly when you get to the next extremely dramatic section. If you do that very slowly, I can't do it.
Apart from tempo, what other clues are you looking for in the score?
Well, Haydn uses various marks, as do other 18th century composers. He puts little dots or dashes above the note, vertical dashes, which tend to mean some sort of shortening. He puts slurs over notes to link them together on the bow or the breath so you don't tongue them. He'll put slurs with dots underneath, so there's a mixture of the two. And he'll put notes with nothing on. Those are basically the possibilities. Of course, what they mean is another matter, because those are all used today, but the language has changed, the accent has changed, and they mean something different. For instance, the slur with the dots nowadays is played rather short. But in Haydn's day, I'm quite sure it was very smooth. Not quite as smooth as a complete slur, but very nearly as smooth. those little details were taken very seriously by the composers and the performers at the time, and indeed they encouraged you to make up your own details as well. Leopold Mozart says a good musician will vary the music as much as is humanly possible. We want the music to speak to people. We want it to speak in its own language, so what we're looking for is its own language. And it is that reaching out from today to the past which makes it, the whole business of playing music which isn't just written today, so extremely interesting and so fascinating. We have a sort of sympathy with the past, which we want to make alive now.
The music demands a certain instrument, and normally the composers get their ideas best with the instruments of their period.
So you play the modern flute as well?
I do, yeah.
Does that cause any confusion about which way you should be playing which instrument?
Not really. I mean, it's a matter of getting used to, actually. But once one's got used to changing the instruments, it automatically adopts, really.
It seems to me it's rather easier for a string player to possibly jump from modern to Baroque or classical, whereas certainly on the oboe, you have to have so many different old instruments from Baroque period, have an English instrument, a French instrument, German instrument, and the same in the classical period and also Romantic. The one has so many
that's 9 instruments so far, and you
Yes.
haven't got to the 20th century yet.
That's right, absolutely, and you're not talking about sort of bigger instruments, oboe de mores and de cachets.
Have you got 9 instruments?
Oh, I've got many more than that.
Meanwhile, out here in the 20th century, most people are still playing this music on 20th century instruments.
The music can take what modern instruments give it. It can take that and produce very beautiful results. It may not be what happened in 1790, but it is beautiful. By the same token, Glenn Gould playing a Bach partita is an amazing experience. It may not at all be what Johann Sebastian heard or even wanted, but I like it and am moved by it and therefore want to hear it. Therefore, my only plea is that fanaticism shouldn't remove very beautiful things from the world, and therefore I will go on conducting Mozart with modern instruments, because the effects and the sound world and I think the emotional experience of people listening to it is still very great.
Alfred Brendel is an intellectual lion of the concert grand. He doesn't like the early piano, which, following Beethoven, he calls the Hammerklavier, and he plays with modern orchestras, so it seems reasonable to suppose that he doesn't like period orchestral instruments either.
There has been an upsurge of real virtuosity on these instruments in the last 30 years, and the best historical orchestras these days are on a level of achievement that sometimes surpasses the conventional orchestras. And for me to listen to a very good performance of a late Haydn symphony on authentic instruments is more satisfying than to listen to a conventional orchestra, because there are certain balances and contrasts, and even the width of the pieces is better exposed.
Have we learnt similar things from the Hammerklavier?
There may be a few details and colors that one gains in certain places. There may be even the odd tailor-made piece that is very beautiful on a period instrument. But on the whole, the modern instrument is, to me, preferable. If I only think of the upper half of the instrument, where the Hammerklavier is so limited in the sustaining power of the note, in the dynamics that it gives. And if I see what the composers requested, if I look at a Mozart piano concerto where a dramatic soprano suddenly sings something and compare it with the relative tinkering of the period instrument, then I'm not as satisfied as with what an orchestra can do.
I wonder if the naval commander in the Falklands did as well out of war as the hero of the Battle of Louisburg, Admiral Boscawen, who completed Hatchlands in 1758. These days it houses the Cobb collection of early keyboard instruments, and we'll be able to see and hear just how much the piano was changing in the very half-century that produced the world's best-selling music, if I can find the way in. Melvin Tan is one of an increasing number of musicians devoting themselves entirely to what are quaintly called period instruments. We don't have periods now, of course. All that's a thing of the past. We'll listen more to Melvin Tan enjoying himself later on, but for now, where better to debate the decay of past glories and their present-day appreciation than in Admiral Boscawen's drawing room, featuring the first work in England of the young Scot Robert Adam. I've got a few more experts: Melvin himself, Nicholas Kenyon, the writer and critic we met in the record shop, Bairn Northcote, columnist and composer, and Alan Hacker. His group, the Music Party, was one of the first to play Mozart and Beethoven on period instruments. What did they learn?
Well, if I could stick to the clarinet, for example, the more I played and I had to restore the instruments myself, I realised that the classical instrument actually had a much more vocal quality, which kind of underlined what all the classical composers were saying, how they wanted everybody, I mean, even C.P. Bach, the harpsichord, wanted every instrument to sing. And I think that was very crucial for me. And the other thing I learnt was that classical instruments have much more colour, and that with the development from, shall we say, this instrument to this instrument, you to a certain extent throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you end up with something which is even and bland. You see, if I play on this clarinet, which was the earliest English clarinet, about 1760. That's the quality of the lowest note. Now, here, it's a rather more nautical quality, I think. And so I think we have lost some of that dark character, which, if you like, Weber uses to describe, the powers of darkness in Freischütz, for example.
The problem is, in the broadest sense, that instruments didn't go on getting improved and changed during Beethoven's lifetime and afterwards for nothing. Instrument makers like Böhm in the 1830s and so on were concerned to produce flutes and clarinets that were more reliable, better in tune, more even, and most important, that projected to larger halls, because what was happening all the time was that more and more people were wanting to hear the orchestra. And the great problem of the classical orchestra, now we have reconstructed it, and particularly, I think Melvin Tan may agree, in piano concertos, is that it simply doesn't project. It projects with a lot of vividness, but it cannot produce the kind of volume that we expect from a modern orchestra, and that something like the period piano particularly, it's very, very difficult to get it to project into large halls.
Well, let's see if Melvin does agree.
It is a slight problem, particularly with Mozart. It's not so much with Beethoven, when, as Bayan said, the pianos got slightly larger and louder, and with a slightly rounder sound.
Well, with no orchestra competing, there's no problems of balance.
Why do we have to talk about instruments improving or not improving? Why can't we just accept that there are different instruments, that there's a whole range of different clarinets, and that it is more appropriate to choose the appropriate clarinet for the piece rather than an inappropriate clarinet? It doesn't affect whether Alan is going to give a good or a bad performance on that instrument, but other things being equal, it certainly predisposes a closer matching of composer to music.
I think the thing is that people take up music for all different kinds of reasons. And I mean, why I took up music was simply because I suppose I wanted to express myself, and I don't really mind what instrument I do it on. But I do think all this that we're talking about, it freshens up our approach to classical music. After all, we play so much of it now, far more than was played in the classical time, that you could almost say we sort of need to earn the right to play more by actually informing ourselves more.
But wouldn't you say, Alan, that it's slightly more than simply making it fresh, because you could pick up a bit of old drain pipe and see what sort of noise that made, and that would give you an idea about how to play a piece.
Even so, it's better to have an expressive drain pipe than an inexpressive boxwood clarinet.
Of course, and an expressive player. More to the point. But what I'm saying is that there is a point at which it clicks. There is a key which goes into a lock, and the code is...
And that's what makes it so exciting.
If a piece is a masterpiece, that is to say, if it's a piece that is found by successive generations over 50 or 100 years to be continually interesting, it is going to be seen from different angles by those people, inevitably, because the whole state of ideas and experience changes all the time. Something like the Eroica, which to its original audience sounded like a wild fantasia, that's one of the critics called it, and there was a man in the gallery who stood up and said, "I'd give another kreutzer if this thing will only end." There was this audience facing, for the first time in their lives, a symphony that lasted 50 minutes, and which ground on and wouldn't let them go. We are never, however much Roger Norrington eloquently stands up in front of his orchestra and tells us what to feel, we are never going to hear it in that sort of way. To say that only the original performing conditions and instruments are an admissible way of looking at that work is to deny the often sensitive and deep understanding of many generations that have come in between. And I wouldn't be ever prepared to do that. was a Mozart symphony series about 10 years ago, which was virtually advertised on the grounds that you haven't heard Mozart yet until you hear this. Now, the reason I get cross about this is because when I wrote an article about 18 months ago questioning certain aspects of authenticity, I had a lot of letters from readers saying, thank goodness somebody has said this, because we had started to feel so guilty about trying to play Mozart or Beethoven on modern cellos and pianos at all. And I think that when an ideology is put across that actually interferes with the natural musicianship and responsiveness of performers, they're made to feel self-conscious that they're not doing it right, then this is a rather worrying thing.
This isn't part of the Cobb collection. It's Melvin's own instrument.
The composer's intention is the buzzword. Now, in fact, if you look at the history of almost any major piece you can think of, you'll often discover that the composer had no idea of his intention until at least after the first performance. He would then proceed to revise, to change. I mean, let us take, in the 20th century, an example like the Writer's Spring by Stravinsky, which Stravinsky was already dissatisfied with during the rehearsals before the first performance. So you can't even set up the conditions of the first performance as an authentic performance. He then proceeded to produce 3 more editions over his lifetime, and in almost every time he rehearsed it, he changed details of rhythm, articulation, and colour again. You're never going to even get a definitive score of the Writer's Spring, let alone an authentic performance, or discover what the hell his intentions ultimately were.
If Mozart was in this room, he'd be jumping up and down with fury at what you're saying, because for all that his intentions may have changed between composition and performance, between rehearsal and performance, his intentions were absolutely clear in matters of articulation, phrasing, and the most extraordinary detail. If you look at the messiest of Mozart's autograph scores, for instance, the C minor piano concerto, many things are unclear, but as it happens, the articulation and the phrasing is clear.
When he decided which order of events he wanted to happen in the first part of the first movement, which he actually changed.
Of course,
whole
but it is
themes
clear.
were switched round.
But it
after.
is clear. You know what he means by looking at that
Yes.
score.
Yes, I'm not suggesting that all composers leave it open.
No,
but
what I'm saying is that there is an element of respect for what can be discerned about the composer's intentions, which goes far beyond simple notes on a page. There are other things which are important, and this raises the whole question.
What do composers think about it all? 30 years after the builders of Hatchlands had created their bit of heritage, the French were busy sweeping theirs away. Where does that leave Pierre Boulez, the architect of today's French musical establishment, composer, conductor, theorist, and founder of IRCAM, the Institute for Acoustic and Musical Research and Coordination?
The more you want to reconstitute a precisely historical moment, the more you take it far away from us. And I think that's very interesting to hear a kind of reconstitution, but just as you see period piece, let's say. But I mean, if the music speaks to us today, that's the music is big enough and strong enough to be performed by all instruments and not only the authentic instruments. I will tell you, for instance, from this point of view, what is my own opinion on my own works. One of my works, Marteau sans maître, performed for the first time in 1955, was involving marimba and vibraphone, 2 instruments which were not very virtuoso at the time. These instruments were played generally at this time with 2 mallets only. And that was very difficult. The part was very difficult because of that, and sometimes awkward. Nowadays, all performers use 4 mallets, which makes things much easier, and the virtuosity has increased enormously. Do I want that one goes back to 2 mallets because it was authentic in 1955? So it would be stupid for myself, from myself to ask for that. For instance, also, you have the Rite of Spring, which begins by a very famous bassoon solo in a very difficult, at this time especially, a difficult register. And I have heard some people, so long ago, 30 or 40 years ago, some people who attended one of the premiere of the Rite of Spring, and they said, well, we are disappointed, now it sounds too easy, and we would like to hear again the bassoon of 1913. Do I want that the bassoon plays, you know, with uneasiness just because we have to go to 1913? When I take the examples in my own lifetime, I find that an absurdity. If my music is strong enough to be performed in 100 years, I cannot say how it will be performed. And I can only wish that it will be strong enough to be able to be performed maybe in quite another way. And I think that's the story of all the great works. They are strong enough for many styles of performance.
Roger Scruton's a philosopher, and he absolutely hates authentic performance. Here's one of his articles. To reduce this tradition of performance to a matter of scholarship
is like putting sex education in the place of love. And suppose the scholars are right. Suppose they have discovered the exact sound made by the orchestras of Bach's or Mozart's day. Their achievement is still a musical irrelevance, for the ear, like the soul, is a living thing which is changed by the history that it makes. The authentic noises do not sound to us as they sounded to Bach or Mozart, any more than the noises made at Aldeburgh sound to a reed-playing Polynesian as they do to the lover of Benjamin Britten.
Roger?
This morning I got up, to my chagrin, when I turned on the radio, the Musica Antiqua Cologne was playing Bach's Fourth Brandenburg Concerto, which is one of the most beautiful of Bach's creations. And the result was absolutely devastating. First of all, in order to keep their authentic instruments going together in the proper coordination, they doubled the speed of the first and last movements. Secondly, coming to the slow movement, which requires enormous expression, which is full of a really profound feeling, they just skated over the surface as though the music was being played like by a pianola or a computer or something. There was a complete lack of balance between the parts. All the elaborate counterpoint was completely destroyed by the wrong part standing out, the wrong instrument suddenly coming into focus, just at the moment when the melodic line should have been kept in abeyance. And this kind of thing was so unmusical. Now, I had to turn the radio off and put the record on with a less authentic performance.
I found it difficult to get people to say that the authentic movement is wrong.
Yes, I suppose it's partly a matter of intimidation. And the fact is that the authentic movement in music is backed up by such a weight of scholarship. And there are so many powerful careers that have been made in it that I think you take your life in your hands, especially if you're a musician, and stand out and speak against it. And I suppose, like modernism in architecture, and indeed modernism in music, it has intimidated the professionals completely.
It's been suggested that the reason for all this back to the past is because people have lost confidence in their own contemporary music. Now, you could say that England is preeminent in the early music field. Is this because English music was particularly unconfident?
I wouldn't agree that first of all, England is well to the fore in the authenticity stakes. I think that in the end, it's a German movement. It stems from Deutsche Grammophon's Archive series, and I think it goes with a very significant feature of modern German culture, which is this fear of emotion. The Germans are afraid of the emotions which they've let loose in the past, in particular through their music, and have tried to sanitize it. That's why I think Musica Antiqua Cologne is perhaps the most important expression of the authentic music, very much part of a German repudiation of the cultural inheritance which is theirs.
Obviously vital to interview the founder of Musica Antiqua of Cologne, Reinhard Goebel, once named the Ayatollah of authenticity. But after hearing Roger Scruton, I didn't fancy meeting the fellow myself, so I sent my producer along. He asked how Goebel went about researching all the background literature.
There is a German edition which releases a lot of the most important books. What is not available as a reprint, I try to get as a film, and I normally get, and then I make my own copies of that film, or let it make, and then I can read it on if the group is on tour. If I'm when I'm sitting in a plane, like tonight, I can read original sources. I'm bringing that with me every time a new book, so that I get through all that literature.
So what sort of details about your performance can you find out from those books?
Nothing.
What do they give you then?
They give a wonderful, strong background of knowledge, but let me to tell the truth is that you have to read 250 pages in old German language and letter type to find out two important sentences. So looking behind the literature, looking behind the curtains of music, that's what interests me. What gives my music making a sort of force.
His real speciality is unaccompanied Biber and Schmelzer, but he's obviously mellowed enough since his Ayatollah days to play for us this comparatively recent mainstream music, a Bach solo fiddle suite.
I have to admit that I can't listen to my own recordings of 10 years ago because I find that so awfully dry and so the German schoolmaster. I think they are what you said, the ingredients and the mixture of today and of formerly, and the mixture of a wonderful violin, but a modern person behind it. That's what gives a certain kind of quality, I think. There's not the question of original, authentic instruments of the time, whatever. I mean, I think we all try to come as near as possible, and but it would be ridiculous to wake up that time even, because we are different. We have different feelings for tempo. We have different feelings for distances, for being warm or for being cold, for being washed or for being dirty.
Goebel's an international figure. Here he is in Holland, professor of Baroque violin at Hilversum, so he'll know about what's going on over here. What does he think about British early music bands labelling themselves authentic?
Ridiculous. Just ridiculous. I mean, to call it authentic is not original. I mean, that's senseless. Coming together with an orchestra where the people yesterday played classical music, play tomorrow, and they play modern music because the union asked it, and then they play Baroque instruments on modern Baroque instruments with bows, and that are definitely classical bows, much too long.
I thought it mellowed.
It's a mix-up. Let me give you an example, that people from London fly over to Amsterdam and form here the so-called Amsterdam's Baroque Orchestra, not at Amsterdam's Baroque Orchestra, as it would be called if they speak Dutch, but that these people can come over and make just an orchestra. Says that there's no difference between the London and between the Amsterdam and obviously the Cologne and the Dresden practices anymore, and that is not authentic, because to every kind of music belongs a different style of performing, like it belongs to every kind of music a different style of violin, of bow, and of harpsichord. The harpsichord is not harpsichord. If you want to play a Froberger toccata, then please do it on an Italian harpsichord, but don't do it on a Tosca of 1780. That is called harpsichord, but it is a harpsichord, but it's not the right instrument for Froberger.
Yeah, what I could do is play a little bit of a sarabande from the 5th French suite.
Well, here is the founder of the Amsterdam Baroque Orchestra, Don Koopman, also a bit of an Ayatollah once, playing an Oxford-built harpsichord of 1990.
So, let's listen a little bit how it was and what it could be.
Here, Koopman's playing a Bach sarabande as written down. But those Baroque composers didn't have time to waste in the days before photocopying. They only sketched the outline and left the twiddly bits to the performer.
As you see, it's already difficult to play exactly what is written, but I think in Bach's time, people would have done something like this.
He's adding little trills and grace notes, jazzing up the rhythm a bit, just as his fancy takes him.
So that's your way, and it's lovely. But Arnold Dolmetsch had his way, and that was lovely, and Wanda Landowska had her way, and that was lovely, and we're convinced now that they were wrong. Perhaps you're wrong.
Yeah, it's quite possible. I think when the early music revival started, and I think it started already in the 19th century, there was the tendency, and I know that still when I started the work as well, that we were like Jehovah's Witnesses. We really believed that it needed to be like that, all the others were stupid. We were a kind of underground movement doing rock concerts with original instruments in places where there were normally pop concerts, and there was a kind of audience who was smoking, and a very special way. And the same musicians from that time are now playing in a Concertgebouw in Amsterdam or in the Queen Elizabeth Hall in Tales. It means something changed, but I think it needs to be very important when you do early music that at one side there are rules, at one side there are many information about how they played, and at one side it's your personal interpretation of those rules, because otherwise it could be like a computer. It's important what you do with it, and you have to accept that you might be as wrong as the others.
Raymond Leppard's modern performing versions of Baroque operas, which played to huge and delighted audiences in the 60s, are now disdained by the inner circle of Baroque specialists. They say he doesn't know the rules. He says they're exclusive.
The exclusive people perform looking over their shoulders all the time. We mustn't do this because of course, Bach did this exactly, so we must do this. There's a great danger in looking too much over your shoulder and thinking you're being followed by a horde of critics and composers and I don't know what else, and an awful lot of rules which are sort of pounding down the road behind you to stop you from really recreating the music and the content of it.
Would you describe your approach to the performance of this sort of music as a compromise?
Surely.
Are there no weaknesses in compromising?
None. There are only virtues in compromise. The whole of life is a compromise, and the sooner we stop thinking in any that it's a disgraceful word, that it implies weakness, it implies betrayal, it does none of those things. It uses the best of every situation and puts it together in the best possible way. To use compromise profitably is what a performer must do. It's what a man living his life must do. You're constantly compromising, and to live it well means you compromise well. And I believe that, the ultimate compromise in performing music, older music, is self-evident, isn't it? You could copy a Bach performance to the numbers, in every conceivable detail, and the one thing that's different is us. And therein lies the compromise you cannot avoid. And it's no good looking over your shoulder and saying, oh no, I won't have a compromise. No, that won't do. It's a nonsense.
Perhaps I should compromise here by getting off and pushing. Somewhere at the top is John Eliot Gardner, conductor and farmer. Over the last 20 years, Gardner has become a versatile and prolific conductor. He's shown the French how to perform their own Baroque operas, he's founded an orchestra at Lyon, but he's still chiefly associated with the Monteverdi choir, which he started when he was at Cambridge, especially to perform Monteverdi's Vespers of the Blessed Virgin. Hardline authenticists regard Gardner's versatility with scepticism, and indeed he's only a recent convert to the older instruments. At first he found they were too unreliable, or rather the players were. But now here's his authentic band, the English Baroque soloists, joined by His Majesty's sagbuts and cornets.
The clue to it is how it communicates. I mean, the conviction, the collective energy and the collective conviction that arises from a working situation, from rehearsals, with a group of highly articulate musicians who have put their neck on the blocks and gone through a lot of trouble to learn their instruments, to overcome the technical treachery of those instruments, and then to evolve a playing style and then to transmit that to an audience. But that very process is inauthentic in the sense that all music written before 1800 is, in a sense, wrenched violently out of its organic soil and the moment you push it into the concert hall. But I think there are all sorts of different ways one can get around this business of the barrier of the concert hall. I mean, the thing that's become very much the fashion now, which is sort of lecture recitals, winning the audience to your point of view, of actually letting them in on the act, which at the same time gives them a very valuable understanding of what you're doing and of what the composer is doing, which is more important. And it also makes them feel that they're participants rather than just spectators staring through a filter. Another way around it, of course, is to set the music in an unexpected location, in an unexpected association.
Associations such as might be created by performing Aida, say, in Luxor, or Il Seraglio in an old harem, or for that matter, Monteverdi's Vespers in St. Mark's in Venice.
The thing that interests me about doing that was not to try and recreate the liturgical context, but to recreate the sense of ritual, theatre, almost operatic, quasi-operatic experience.
It seems to me that what you're saying could boil down to one of two things. Either you're saying, look, here's something that you don't understand, and I'll tell you all about it, or on the other hand, you're saying, here's something very exotic. Come and be enchanted by something very different.
No, that's not quite what I'm saying.
Well,
I mean, the first sounds a very didactic purpose, and I don't like the implications of that, because it certainly does have a slight... I've experienced it. It does have a sort of self-congratulatory smugness about, you know, we're the initiates, we're in on the act, we are participants, privileged participants, and of course we don't go to any other concerts, we go to these, and I mean, that's awful. I mean, that's one of the things that gives the whole early music movement, which is basically a fundamentally positive and exciting thing, it gives it a bad name because it looks cliquey and it looks smug.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
I suppose an example of the sort of traditions and ritual that you were talking about is whether people stand up or not in the Hallelujah chorus in Handel's Messiah.
Yes, I mean, if they want to do that, why not? I mean, if they feel strongly about it. But it's not something one would want to foster or encourage, because it's... I mean, there are traditions of the past that with the research into historical context and performing practice, people actively encourage, like, for instance, applause between movements of a Beethoven symphony. It seems to me utter nonsense. I mean, why bring back the seamy side of the past?
Well, who chooses which is the seamy side?
Well, the performer has a right to do that, and so does the audience. I mean, why should the audience be obliged or even be sort of encouraged to do something that's against their inner feelings? I mean, that seems to me bogus.
We don't want applause so that people will tell us how wonderful we are. We want applause so that the audience can feel as if they're joining in, which is what a concert's about. At home, you don't have to applaud at home. You know, you don't have to applaud your record player, but when you're in a concert, I think it's great when the audience applauds. I like jazz concerts because people are they enjoy. They clap in the middle. They're saying, "Come on, go for it. We're enjoying ourselves. Come on, play some more."
Tradition could be said to be what the audience expects. Do you take into account their expectation?
Absolutely not. Much as I appreciate the audience when it is quiet and tunes into my concentration and gets my message and enjoys what I am doing, I am there to convince the audience of my convictions.
So to recreate the expectations of former audiences is quite irrelevant.
Indeed it is. It is also, I would say, immoral in the context of performance to set out to do what the audience does not want and to flabbergast your listeners in doing everything upside down. There are performers who do that, and with all my respect and love for some of the authentic performances, there is the odd performer where I have the impression that he enjoys mainly doing this.
This discovering of the past is nothing new, is it?
I cannot understand colleagues who do not have the urge to use a good edition or to make sure themselves in looking into the primary sources as often as possible what the composer wrote down. But of course, when you have a clean text, this is only the beginning. Then the clean text, I mean the text has to be made alive. And there are, I would say, 3 stages. The stage of the curator of a museum, the stage of an executor of a will, and if you are very lucky and very talented, the task of an obstetrician.
No obstetricians at Covent Garden, as far as I know, but there is a doctor in the house. Well, Geoffrey Tate qualified as a doctor, and he still finds the opportunity to practice a bit of surgery.
Look, every composer I've ever worked with, modern composer I've ever worked with, was prepared to actually let me recompose the damn stuff, let alone, I mean, he was delighted to have it done, but was prepared to have it recomposed also. I mean, and I was, obviously, that's a very impressive experience when you have it, because it makes you realize these people are also, they want to have it done. If you think that's better and it works and they hear that it works, they're prepared to have it done. Rescoring, reharmonizing, taking up that instrument. If the conductor can show that it's a good idea, they'll do it. And I'm sure Mozart was exactly the same. And I'm sure that he would have been delighted to hear Metzger and myself do Mozart on a modern piano and a modern orchestra. I mean, he wouldn't have minded in the slightest. But that isn't an argument that you should ever use. It's a dangerous argument, I think, to say that Mozart wouldn't have minded.
I think it is not interesting to know what Mozart would have said, because he cannot be in a position where he could say, when he can say something. As I mean, you know, this kind of supposition makes me think always of the sentence of Pascal. If the nose of Cleopatra would have been longer, the face of the world would have been changed. And I am not interested at all in the if about the nose of Cleopatra.
I don't suppose Mendelssohn would have turned his nose up at this sort of performance.
From Hungerford.
London and elsewhere, period orchestras are drawing large, enthusiastic crowds. That's got to be a good thing, hasn't it?
That's a kind of exoticism. And they are going to an exotic country, and they are very pleased because if you see, you know, a Hawaiian girl in London, it will be just like that. If you see a Hawaiian girl in Hawaii, you think that you are in the paradise. And I think that this kind of rather cheap exoticism, I would like, is what pleases this type of audience.
Amazing! What an amazing remark.
Is that right? You're just exotic, are you?
Well, it's nice. It's nice, I suppose. It sells seats to be exotic. It's a curious idea, isn't it? He seems very frightened of the notion that it might work, that it might be important, or that it might, worst of all, that it might be successful. The fact is that until very recently, an authentic performance was a performance of Boulez's ideal, where the performer had all the ideas, the performer made the running. That has many exciting results, and it is one way of looking at it. We've turned that on its head, really. We've said the performer is very important, but we're fascinated by the history.
Do we tolerate lots of different sorts of music today, simply because we haven't got a very strong cultural identity of our own?
Good question. I was just about to ask the same question myself. I mean, maybe it's a sign of our great feebleness, of our great cultural feebleness.
But how do you feel to be a symptom of our cultural feebleness?
I feel fine, because I feel that I'm doing something very positive and very creative, and it may be a symptom, but you know, even if you're being swept out to sea, you can still swim for home. And
you can still swim for the sea, though. That's the point, isn't it? I mean, this is what Boulez is saying. You're swimming for home.
Yeah.
He would prefer to swim for the sea.
Maybe he would, but he could disappear in a welter of spray. Maybe we're so unable to identify emotionally with a lot of modern music. The best, of course, is super. But a lot of it is extremely arid, and I'm sure that will pass. If it's so arid that we want something else to be creative about, then we've found it. And you know, there are several avant-gardes in music nowadays, and certainly one of them is performing music you thought you knew in an extremely novel manner. That's the creative part. That's what's so exciting about going back, you know. People feel as if history is far away, it's somehow distant in the past, you know, but it isn't. It's very close to us. I mean, 3 of my lifetimes, and you're talking to Weber, and Schubert, and Schumann, and Beethoven's just dead, and Berlioz is busy writing all his great works. I mean, that's 3 lifetimes. I mean, what are we talking about? What is this past, this distant past? It's not distant, it's just round the corner. And they're our great-great-grandfathers, and they've got things to tell us, you know. Don't cut them off, Mr. Boulez. Don't only live in the future, because you have roots in the past. Don't become a rootless individual.
As yet, historical performers are few and far between, and the suitable venues aren't very big, so the live audience is small. But record sales are booming. Everyone wants to join in, even the newest arrivals.
Well, right from the start we decided to have a period performance label, and we felt we wanted to make an impact. We were the new boys on the block. Everyone was wondering what Richard Branson's new classical record label would be up to. But we're a commercial organisation, and we wanted to do something which would really have major sales potential. And I saw that Roger Norrington and other well-known people in this business were moving further and further forward in time, quite rightly, through the end of the classical period into the early Romantics. So we thought we'd just jump in ahead and tackle 2 major masterpieces from that period, Schubert's Ninth Symphony and Mendelssohn's Italian Symphony.
And how did the Schubert Great C Major Symphony sell?
Happily, extremely well. I think it must be, well, it's certainly our biggest seller on the Veritas label, and I can say one interesting thing is I cannot imagine a modern symphony orchestra with one of the world's great conductors selling as many copies as we have of this.
So, period performance is big business?
Yes, it can be, but it would be a poor label that just chose those pieces that had real sales potential. But certainly period performance versions of the 4 Seasons have, until recently, dominated the classical chart.
What proportion of Virgin Classics is Virgin Veritas?
Well, we did a calculation the other day and we're astonished to find that about 37% of our recordings since we launched the label in '87 are for Veritas.
How much of the recent upsurge in period performance sales is due to digital technology?
I think the coexistence of the CD and the early music movement has been very mutually beneficial. A very symbiotic relationship between the two. Simply because I think people have noticed the phenomenon that as one moves further forward in musical history, the sound becomes more and more like what one is used to. And indeed, if we had any criticism for Schubert 9, it was because it sounded rather too much like a normal symphony orchestra.
Once upon a time, there was a golden age, or that's how it sometimes seems, when the nearest you came to arguing about musical style was whether you preferred Brahms to Wagner. But then we became aware of ourselves and our inner motivations. Music became self-conscious. And now we were self-aware. Could we go on playing in the old instinctive way? New ways had to be invented. Glenn Gould's quirky, unhistoric way with Bach. That expressive drain pipe of Alan Hacker's. Or John Elliott Gardner's exotic locations. Anything to get out of the concert hall. And perhaps the historical approach is just one more way. It's easy to see why it caught on. Not only is it new, with all the state-of-the-art appeal of a compact disc, it's old too. You might say it's a branch of the heritage industry. And above all, it's right, or it claims to be. What Nick Kenyon calls the key that fits the lock. But does the music need to be unlocked? And if so, is the historical approach setting it free forever, or just for us, just for now? No matter what the glossy inducements are, we'll just have to make up our own minds. And I'm further from making up mine than when I started asking all these questions. But perhaps that doesn't matter. However we strike the balance between history and instinct, between gut strings and gut reaction, we must all keep searching in the music for our own truths.